The world was not ready for him. The night Alexander was born, a fire consumed the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the world. The priests wailed that the goddess herself was too preoccupied giving birth to a world destroyer to protect her own shrine. This violent omen set the stage for a life that would burn away the old world and forge a new one in its ashes. Alexander was the son of 2 titans who despised each other, Philip II, the brilliant, one-eyed king of Macedon, and Olympias, the dark, intense queen who claimed descent from Achilles. Philip was a man of steel, a master strategist who had transformed Macedon from a backward kingdom into the dominant power of Greece. Olympias was a creature of myth, rumored to sleep with snakes, believing she had conceived Alexander not with a man, but with the god Zeus himself. This conflict, the grounded reality of genius Philip and the soaring divine madness of Olympias, was the crucible that formed Alexander's soul. The world was not ready for him. The night Alexander was born, a fire consumed the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the world. The priests wailed that the goddess herself was too preoccupied giving birth to a world destroyer to protect her own shrine. This violent omen set the stage for a life that would burn away the old world and forge a new one in its ashes. Alexander was the son of 2 titans who despised each other, Philip II, the brilliant, one-eyed king of Macedon, and Olympias, the dark, intense queen who claimed descent from Achilles. Philip was a man of steel, a master strategist who had transformed Macedon from a backward kingdom into the dominant power of Greece. Olympias was a creature of myth, rumored to sleep with snakes, believing she had conceived Alexander not with a man, but with the god Zeus himself. This conflict, the grounded reality of genius Philip and the soaring divine madness of Olympias, was the crucible that formed Alexander's soul. From his earliest days, Alexander was trained not just as a prince, but as a god-sent weapon. Philip hired Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of the age, to be his tutor. Aristotle did not teach him only mathematics and rhetoric. He taught Alexander about the world he was destined to conquer. He taught him Homer's Iliad, which Alexander carried with him always, seeing himself as the new Achilles, destined for a short, glorious life. Yet, all the philosophy and poetry in the world could not tame the fire in his spirit. This became clear with the horse, Bucephalus. The magnificent Thessalian stallion was wild, aggressive, and too fearsome for any man to mount. Philip was about to send the beast away, but Alexander, a mere boy, stepped forward. He noticed the horse was terrified of its own shadow. Simply by turning Bucephalus to face the sun, eliminating the shadow that haunted it, Alexander calmed the steed and rode him. Philip wept tears of pride, but his words were a prophecy. "My son, find yourself a kingdom equal to your size. Macedon is too small for you." This moment marked the beginning of Alexander's awareness that his destiny lay beyond the borders of his father's domain. As Alexander grew older, the rift between his parents became a chasm. Philip, ever the pragmatist, saw his son as a powerful, but sometimes volatile, asset. He sought to secure the Macedonian throne by marrying a pure-blooded Macedonian woman, Cleopatra Eurydice. This was a grave insult to Olympias, implying Alexander was less than a full Macedonian heir. At the wedding feast, Cleopatra's uncle, Attalus, a powerful general, stood and toasted the couple, praying for legitimate heirs to the throne. Alexander, already drunk on wine and rage, leaped to his feet. "Do you take me for a bastard then, you villain?" he screamed, hurling his wine cup at the man. Philip, already drunk himself, drew his sword and stumbled toward his son. He fell, saved from violence by his own intoxication. "Look, men," Alexander shouted. "Here's the man who plans to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one couch to the next." The damage was irreparable. Alexander and his mother, sensing their lives were in danger, fled into exile. The tension was a taut bowstring ready to snap. Alexander returned only briefly before the final, brutal twist of fate. Philip, having cemented his power and prepared the grand invasion of Persia that would define Alexander's life, organized a massive celebration. He walked into the theater without his bodyguards, demonstrating his confidence and his divine protection. But Philip's many enemies, political rivals, disgruntled former lovers, or maybe the agents of a vengeful Olympias, were waiting. Pausanias, a former bodyguard slighted by the king, rushed forward and plunged a dagger deep into Philip's side. The king of Macedon, the man who had built the war machine, fell dead, his legacy instantly overshadowed by his sudden, shocking murder. Chaos erupted. Alexander, a 20-year-old boy, instantly became the king of Macedon, master of the greatest army the European world had ever seen, and inheritor of a blood oath to destroy the Persian Empire. The assassination was a horrific tragedy, yet for Alexander, it was the key that unlocked his destiny. He ascended the throne on a river of his father's blood, fully aware that the empire Philip had created would either devour him or be his to command. The world held its breath, waiting to see if the lion cub would prove worthy of his violent inheritance. To the strongest, the theft of the king's body. The air in Babylon was thick and heavy, not just with the oppressive heat of the Mesopotamian summer, but with the suffocating weight of fear and raw, unbridled ambition. Alexander the Great, the king of Asia, lay dead, his body already embalmed but still visible to his grieving, horrified generals. His last whispered command, to the strongest, was not a clear succession plan, but a lethal challenge, a final, spiteful act that plunged the world into immediate and devastating conflict. The power vacuum was absolute, a chasm capable of swallowing everything the Macedonians had fought, bled, and died for. The immediate tension centered around the massive, marble throne, now achingly empty, and the great tent where the generals, the Diadochi, gathered to decide the fate of an empire that stretched from the Aegean to the Industry. They were the men who had ridden with the king, who had saved his life 100 times, and who now felt entitled to claim his inheritance. The first struggle was symbolic. Who would rule? Alexander's half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus, was mentally disabled and easily manipulated. His wife, Roxana, was pregnant with a true heir, but that child, Alexander IV, was not yet born. The infantry, the hardened veterans of the phalanx, demanded Philip Aridaeus be king, while the powerful companion cavalry and the generals demanded a regent. The compromise forged in that chaotic, tense week was a recipe for disaster. 2 kings, neither capable of ruling, and a supreme regent, Perdiccas, Alexander's most senior commander, tasked with holding the sprawling, unstable empire together. Perdiccas was a formidable soldier, but he inherited not an empire, but a death sentence. The moment the agreement was finalized, the partition of Babylon, each general who walked out of the tent had already begun planning his own rebellion. They had sworn loyalty to the twin kings, but their eyes were fixed on the map, calculating the distance to their assigned satrapies, the provincial governorships that they intended to transform into personal kingdoms. The first act of definitive treachery belonged to Ptolemy. He was assigned the satrapy of Egypt, the wealthiest and most easily defensible piece of the entire empire. Ptolemy was a close friend, a trusted general, but unlike Perdiccas, he had no interest in holding the whole thing together. He intended to secure Egypt and make it his own. His strategic goal became the ultimate symbol of legitimacy, the body of Alexander. Alexander's corpse had been ceremoniously prepared for its final journey back to the Macedonian capital, a journey that would be a monumental procession of grief and power. The funeral carriage was a masterpiece of engineering and wealth, a gilded, columned temple on wheels, decorated with gold, armor, and jewels, drawn by 64 mules. Perdiccas intended to send it home. Ptolemy knew it belonged in Egypt. As the procession wound its way toward Macedon, Ptolemy's forces struck in a lightning-fast, highly coordinated raid. They seized the royal corpse and diverted the entire procession south, toward Alexandria. This theft was a declaration of war, a sacred violation that could not be ignored. By possessing Alexander's body, Ptolemy claimed the divine mandate turning his desert kingdom into the spiritual successor of the conquest. Perdiccas, enraged and knowing he could not be regent without total authority, was forced to act. He launched an immediate, desperate invasion of Egypt to crush Ptolemy. This campaign was an abject failure. The Nile River, the lifeblood of Egypt, proved to be Perdiccas' executioner. During a disastrous attempt to cross a fortified branch of the river, Perdiccas lost thousands of men to the swift currents and Ptolemy's fortified defenses. His authority evaporated instantly. His own generals, seeing the collapse of their leader's power and the growing strength of Ptolemy, assassinated Perdiccas in his tent. The death of the regent eliminated the last man attempting to enforce unity. The floodgates of ambition were now fully open. The wars of the Diadochi had begun in earnest, a brutal, desperate scramble for power where friendship meant nothing and the only true loyalty was to the size of one's own army. The empire was now leaderless and officially dedicated to the pursuit of the strongest. The Golden Cage, Ptolemy and the Library of the World. With the decisive, elephant-backed victory at Ipsus, the dream of a unified empire was laid to rest, buried under the weight of Macedonian steel and Indian ivory. Ptolemy, the shrewd, cautious friend who had seized Alexander's body and the entire Nile basin, emerged as the most secure of the successors. While Antigonus was dead and Seleucus was grappling with a vast, untamed east, Ptolemy was consolidating his kingdom behind the twin moats of the sea and the desert. He was no longer a general. He was the first pharaoh of a new, Greek-speaking dynasty, reigning as Ptolemy I Soter, Ptolemy the Savior. His ambition was no longer military conquest, but a lasting, unassailable legitimacy that would outshine his turbulent Macedonian origins. His seat of power was not ancient Memphis, but the shining new city planned by Alexander himself, Alexandria. The first struggle was symbolic. Who would rule? Alexander's half-brother, Philip III Aristeus, was mentally disabled and easily manipulated. His wife, Roxana, was pregnant with a true heir, but that child, Alexander IV, was not yet born. The infantry, the hardened veterans of the phalanx, demanded Philip Aristeus be king, while the powerful companion cavalry and the generals demanded a regent. The compromise forged in that chaotic, tense week was a recipe for disaster. Two kings, neither capable of ruling, and a supreme regent, Perdiccas, Alexander's most senior commander, tasked with holding the sprawling, unstable empire together. Perdiccas was a formidable soldier, but he inherited not an empire, but a death sentence. The moment the agreement was finalized, the partition of Babylon, each general who walked out of the tent had already begun planning his own rebellion. They had sworn loyalty to the twin kings, but their eyes were fixed on the map, calculating the distance to their assigned satrapies, the provincial governorships that they intended to transform into personal kingdoms. The first act of definitive treachery belonged to Ptolemy. He was assigned the satrapy of Egypt, the wealthiest and most easily defensible piece of the entire empire. Ptolemy was a close friend, a trusted general, but unlike Perdiccas, he had no interest in holding the whole thing together. He intended to secure Egypt and make it his own. His strategic goal became the ultimate symbol of legitimacy, the body of Alexander. Alexander's corpse had been ceremoniously prepared for its final journey back to the Macedonian capital, a journey that would be a monumental procession of grief and power. The funeral carriage was a masterpiece of engineering and wealth, a gilded, columned temple on wheels, decorated with gold, armor, and jewels, drawn by 64 mules. Perdiccas intended to send it home. Ptolemy knew it belonged in Egypt. As the procession wound its way toward Macedon, Ptolemy's forces struck in a lightning-fast, highly coordinated raid. They seized the royal corpse and diverted the entire procession south, toward Alexandria. This theft was a declaration of war, a sacred violation that could not be ignored. By possessing Alexander's body, Ptolemy claimed the divine mandate, turning his desert kingdom into the spiritual successor of the conquest. Perdiccas, enraged and knowing he could not be regent without total authority, was forced to act. He launched an immediate, desperate invasion of Egypt to crush Ptolemy. This campaign was an abject failure. The Nile River, the lifeblood of Egypt, proved to be Perdiccas's executioner. During a disastrous attempt to cross a fortified branch of the river, Perdiccas lost thousands of men to the swift currents and Ptolemy's fortified defenses. His authority evaporated instantly. His own generals, seeing the collapse of their leader's power and the growing strength of Ptolemy, assassinated Perdiccas in his tent. The death of the regent eliminated the last man attempting to enforce unity. The floodgates of ambition were now fully open. The wars of the Diadochi had begun in earnest, a brutal, desperate scramble for power where friendship meant nothing and the only true loyalty was to the size of one's own army. The empire was now leaderless and officially dedicated to the pursuit of the strongest. The Golden Cage, Ptolemy and the Library of the World. With the decisive, elephant-backed victory at Ipsus, the dream of a unified empire was laid to rest, buried under the weight of Macedonian steel and Indian ivory. Ptolemy, the shrewd, cautious friend who had seized Alexander's body and the entire Nile basin, emerged as the most secure of the successors. While Antigonus was dead and Seleucus was grappling with a vast, untamed east, Ptolemy was consolidating his kingdom behind the twin moats of the sea and the desert. He was no longer a general. He was the first pharaoh of a new, Greek-speaking dynasty, reigning as Ptolemy I Soter, Ptolemy the Savior. His ambition was no longer military conquest, but a lasting, unassailable legitimacy that would outshine his turbulent Macedonian origins. His seat of power was not ancient Memphis, but the shining new city planned by Alexander himself, Alexandria. Alexandria was designed to be the nexus of the Greek world, built in a prime location where the Mediterranean met the vast wealth of the Nile. Ptolemy poured the fortunes of Egypt, the greatest agricultural wealth in the ancient world, into making it a marble and granite spectacle. It was a city of absolute precision, laid out on a grid plan, centered around the two massive, symbolic achievements of his reign, the Serapeum and the Pharos. The Serapeum was the grand temple dedicated to Serapis, a deity engineered by Ptolemy himself as a deliberate fusion of Greek and Egyptian gods, Osiris and Apis, merged with Zeus and Hades. This was the essence of Ptolemaic rule: respect the local traditions enough to govern smoothly, but Hellenize the culture enough to remain Macedonian masters. The other marvel, the Pharos of Alexandria, was a lighthouse so monumental, taller than any skyscraper of its time, that it became another of the seven wonders of the ancient world. It was not just a navigation tool, it was a brazen statement, projecting the power and wealth of the Ptolemaic dynasty across the entire Mediterranean. Yet, Ptolemy's most profound contribution was a silent, intellectual conquest. He dedicated the immense state wealth to founding the Mouseion, the Temple of the Muses, and its attached, legendary Library of Alexandria. The library was not a mere collection of scrolls, it was an active research institute, a university before the concept existed. Scholars, scientists, and poets, the greatest minds of the Hellenistic world, were lured to Alexandria with lavish salaries, state-sponsored meals, and the promise of endless knowledge. Euclid codified geometry here. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy. This institution was a deliberate political tool. By owning all human knowledge, Ptolemy made Alexandria the cultural capital of the world, guaranteeing that even those who hated the Ptolemies would still need their city, their books, and their brilliance. The ultimate symbol of his triumph remained Alexander's body. Ptolemy built a magnificent tomb, the Sema, within Alexandria, where the gilded coffin lay in state. The city became the center of the cult of Alexander. By keeping the hero's physical remains, Ptolemy perpetually anchored the legitimacy of his rule to the great conqueror. The Ptolemies became synonymous with Alexander's divinity. But the price of this golden isolation was high. Over the generations, the dynasty grew intensely insular, fearful of outside challenge, and obsessed with purity. Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the son and successor, initiated the shocking trend of brother-sister marriage, sibling incest. He married his full sister, Arsinoe II, a practice rooted in the ancient Egyptian pharaonic tradition but deeply unsettling to the Greeks. This was done to concentrate the sacred bloodline and solidify the divine, unchallengeable status of the Ptolemaic throne. This descent into incestuous, opulent isolation created a golden cage. The Ptolemies ruled a kingdom of stunning wealth, protected by geography and legitimacy, but they became increasingly removed from the Macedonians they ruled and the Egyptians they governed. The core was characterized by unimaginable luxury, complex court politics, and frequent, brutal violence within the family, all hidden behind the impenetrable power of the Egyptian throne. Ptolemy I had secured the dynasty through genius and theft. His successors secured it through blood purity and the relentless acquisition of wealth and knowledge. The fate of the entire dynasty, however, was sealed by this combination of brilliance and degeneracy, leading inevitably toward the final, dramatic collision with the rising power of Rome, a story whose greatest icon would be the last great Ptolemy, the magnificent Cleopatra. The Hellenistic world was vast, but its glittering heart beat solely on the banks of the Egyptian Nile. The impossible map, Seleucus and the empire of 1,000 peoples. The Battle of Ipsus had elevated Seleucus I Nicator, the victor, to the status of an unparalleled titan. While Ptolemy had secured the jewel of Egypt, Seleucus inherited the vast, terrifying geographical heart of Alexander's conquests, a domain that stretched like a broken sword blade from the Mediterranean coast of Syria, across the twin rivers of Mesopotamia, through the Persian plateau, and eastward into the untamed lands of Bactria and Sogdiana. This immense territory was the Seleucid Empire, a kingdom of thousands of miles, 100 different languages, and a dozen warring cultures. It was the legacy of Alexander in its purest, most chaotic form, and its sheer size was both its greatest strength and its terminal weakness. Seleucus was a study in contrast to the fiery Alexander and the shrewd Ptolemy. He was less flamboyant than his peers, a general known for his immense stature, quiet cunning, and unwavering patience. He had survived the bloodbath of the Diadochi by knowing when to retreat, when to fight, and when to ally. After the victory over Antigonus at Ipsus, Seleucus's first challenge was not a rival general, but the burden of scale. How do you govern an empire where news travels slower than a caravan and where every mountain range hides a new, hostile tribe? His answer was the core tenet of the Hellenistic age: urbanization. He launched a massive, state-sponsored campaign to found new, strategically placed Greek cities across the Near East, designed to be beacons of Hellenic culture and military control. His most famous creations were the twin capitals. On the Mediterranean coast of Syria, he founded Antioch, a city destined to become one of the most important cultural centers of the Roman world, a glittering showpiece for Greek art and philosophy. On the Tigris River, he founded Seleucia on the Tigris, a city meant to replace Babylon as the administrative capital of Mesopotamia. These cities were populated by thousands of Macedonian veterans and Greek colonists, turning them into military and cultural anchor points in the vast, turbulent landscape. They were more than cities. They were fortified islands of Western power, intended to civilize and control the surrounding Asian populations. But for every new Greek theater erected, there were 100 local temples, 100 local customs, and 1,000 local resentments barely held in check by the Seleucid garrisons. The true test of the Seleucid limits came in the Far East. Before Ipsus, Seleucus had been forced to confront the loss of Alexander's furthest conquests, the Indian territories. Unlike his Macedonian predecessors, the indigenous populations of India were not ruled by rival kings, but by the unified power of the Mauryan Empire, led by the brilliant and formidable Chandragupta Maurya. Facing a massive, centralized Indian power, Seleucus realized the impossibility of holding ground so far from his administrative heartlands. In a deeply pragmatic, un-Alexander-like move, Seleucus abandoned the Indian provinces in exchange for a staggering, invaluable strategic payment: 500 war elephants. This diplomatic maneuver, known as the Mauryan Treaty, secured the beastly army that would ultimately crush Antigonus at Ipsus, but it meant sacrificing the Indus Valley and accepting the fixed boundary between the Hellenic and Indian worlds. This loss cemented the fact that Alexander's dream of a world empire was too large for even his successors to manage. As the Seleucid Empire matured, it became a massive, wealthy target. The constant stress of internal conflict, rival governors, succession crises, and dynastic murders was exacerbated by the rise of new, powerful threats on its borders. In the northeast, the Parthians, a tough, nomadic Iranian people, began to chip away at the eastern satrapies. To the west, the Seleucids were constantly locked in a desperate, century-long series of wars, the Syrian Wars, against the Ptolemies, fighting over the strategically vital coastal territories of Judea and Coele Syria. These wars bled both kingdoms dry, wasting the wealth and military manpower that Alexander's generation had amassed. The empire, governed by the long-distance vision of Seleucus and his immediate descendants, became a tragic battlefield where Greek kings fought in Persian lands, using Indian elephants, all while slowly being consumed by the sheer difficulty of maintaining control. It was an empire constantly fragmenting, perpetually at war, a glittering, unstable crown passed down through a lineage of kings increasingly detached from the Macedonian vigor of their founder. The final, fatal flaw of the Seleucid Empire was the simple, unstoppable erosion of distance, time, and ambition, guaranteeing that its future would be defined not by conquest, but by the endless struggle for survival. The Iron Cradle, Antigonids, and the Yoke of Greece. Macedon, the mountainous cradle of Alexander, was the geographic heart of the Hellenistic world, yet it proved to be the most unstable. After the death of Antigonus the One-Eyed at Ipsus, the true prize, the homeland, fell into the hands of the third major dynasty, the Antigonids. The general who secured this bloody inheritance was Antigonus II Gonatas, the grandson of the deceased Titan, and a man who possessed the pragmatism of Philip II and the tenacity of his own infamous ancestor. He inherited not a united kingdom, but a relentless, draining war. His primary problem was that the fierce, independent spirit of the Greek city-states, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, refused to die. They saw the Antigonids not as native rulers, but as tyrants imposing a yoke of foreign military control, perpetually threatening the very concept of Greek liberty. The decades following Ipsus were defined by this eternal conflict between the Macedonian iron fist and the restless, philosophical heart of Greece. Antigonus Gonatas was a king fighting on two fronts, consolidating his power internally against dynastic rivals and externally crushing the endless Greek revolts. But a force more terrifying than any Macedonian general or Greek patriot suddenly erupted from the north, the Gauls. These terrifying Celtic warriors, huge, fierce, and utterly heedless of civilization, surged southward across the Balkans in 279 BC, sweeping through Macedon and threatening to annihilate the Greek world entirely. They were driven by plunder and primal violence, leaving a path of horror and destruction behind them. This invasion was a moment of supreme crisis, a genuine existential threat that temporarily halted the feuding. In Macedon, the sitting king, Ptolemy Keranos, a former rival of the Ptolemies who had briefly seized the throne, was captured, decapitated, and his head paraded on a pike by the terrifying barbarians. Macedon descended into anarchy. It was Antigonus II Gonatas who stepped forward to meet the challenge, recognizing that defending the homeland was his only path to legitimate kingship. He gathered the remaining Macedonian armies and prepared for a decisive, desperate stand. The critical moment came at the Battle of Lysimachia. The Gauls, emboldened by easy victory and loaded with Macedonian plunder, were confident. Gonatas, however, used cunning, not brute force. He positioned his army strategically, allowing the Gauls to charge his flanks before striking their exhausted center with the disciplined, relentless Macedonian phalanx. Gonatas crushed the barbarian horde, sending the survivors fleeing north. This victory was Gonatas's crowning moment. By saving Macedon from utter devastation, he was hailed as a true national hero and savior. The Macedonians accepted his rule not just by right of succession, but by right of service and divine deliverance. With his northern flank secure, Ganadas could now apply his full attention and the terrifying might of his veterans to the Greeks. The result was the Cremonidian War, a desperate alliance of Athens and Sparta, financed by the Ptolemies, who wanted to keep Macedon weak, attempting one last, glorious bid for independence. The war was brutal and inevitable. Athens was blockaded by sea and besieged by land. The city, starved and isolated, was eventually forced to surrender. Ganadas did not destroy Athens like Alexander had destroyed Thebes. He simply garrisoned the city, installing his own philosophical general as the governor. Greek independence was not annihilated. It was merely put into an iron cage. Under Antigonus Ganadas, Macedon was transformed into the Hellenic policeman. The Antigonids controlled the crucial strategic points of Greece, the Piraeus harbor of Athens, the Acrocorinth fortress that controlled the isthmus, and the island of Euboea. They did not conquer the entire territory, but they controlled the economic and military arteries, allowing a semblance of freedom while holding the real power. This allowed for the flourishing of the Hellenistic culture and philosophy. Ganadas himself was a student of the Cynics and Stoics, but it was a cultural freedom underpinned by the ultimate reality of Macedonian pikes. The Antigonid army, the direct descendants of Alexander's phalanx, was the ultimate deterrent. Every Greek knew that the moment they challenged the king in Pella, the Macedonian war machine would march south, and their fragile liberty would be crushed beneath the weight of organized violence. The Antigonid dynasty maintained this precarious balance for over a century, constantly embroiled in localized wars and internal tensions. They were strong enough to rule the Greek peninsula, but never quite strong enough to seize the massive wealth of Egypt or Asia. They were the stabilizing anchor of the Hellenistic world, providing the professional soldiers and officers who served across all three great kingdoms. But while their gaze was fixed firmly on the Aegean and the southern Greek cities, a new, far more dangerous enemy was rising swiftly in the western Mediterranean, an enemy that operated not by the rules of kings and elephants, but by the relentless, organized efficiency of the Roman Republic. The clock was ticking, and Macedon, the birthplace of empire, was destined to be the first of the successor kingdoms to fall to the inevitable shadow from the west. The shadow from the west, the fall of Macedon. For over a century, the three Hellenistic kingdoms had focused their hatred, their armies, and their ambitions inward, fighting each other over Alexander's fragmented map. They had become accustomed to the rules of the game: massive, professional armies, dramatic siege warfare, and the decisive power of the elephant charge. But across the Adriatic Sea, in the rugged hills of Italy, a new power had risen, operating by an entirely different, terrifying set of rules. This was the Roman Republic, a state driven not by the personal glory of a single king, but by the cold, disciplined, and relentless will of its Senate. When Rome finally shattered Carthage in the devastating Punic Wars, it turned its gaze eastward, across the narrow strait, and saw not kings, but tempting, wealthy targets ripe for interference. The stage for the final act was set by Philip V, the reigning Antigonid king of Macedon. Philip was a man of immense charm, military talent, and a deep, ancestral conviction that Macedon was the natural ruler of the Greek world. But he possessed a fatal flaw: overconfidence. As Rome wrestled with the existential threat of Hannibal Barca during the Second Punic War, Philip V made a catastrophic miscalculation. He saw Rome's distraction as his opportunity, forming a strategic alliance with Hannibal against the Republic. This act, the First Macedonian War, was Rome's introduction to the Hellenistic world. Though the initial conflict ended in a stalemate, it drew the cold, calculating attention of the Roman Senate toward the east. Rome saw Philip not just as a king, but as a dangerous, destabilizing force that threatened the balance of power they intended to create. A decade later, Rome returned, stronger and more determined, initiating the Second Macedonian War. This was not merely a border skirmish. It was a showdown between two fundamentally different military systems. On one side stood the Macedonian phalanx, the formation perfected by Philip II and Alexander, an impenetrable forest of 18-foot sarissas, designed to be an unstoppable iron wall. On the other stood the Roman legion, a flexible, segmented force of highly adaptable soldiers armed with short swords, gladius, and heavy javelins, pilum. The legion was designed to be fluid, capable of operating effectively on uneven terrain and absorbing shocks, unlike the phalanx, which was rigid and vulnerable to flanks. The ultimate, decisive collision occurred at the Battle of Cynocephaly, the Dog's Heads, in 197 BC. The terrain was hilly and broken, the worst possible ground for the long spears of the phalanx. As the two armies clashed, the phalanx initially held the center, their sarissas crushing the Roman lines. But a critical segment of the Macedonian formation, struggling to deploy on the uneven ground, became disorganized. A young Roman tribune, seeing the vulnerability, detached 20 maniples, a small, flexible legionary unit, and, in a brilliant moment of battlefield improvisation, led them around the rear of the Macedonian line. The Roman soldiers attacked the phalanx from behind, where their armor and pikes offered no protection. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The phalanx, unable to pivot quickly or fight hand-to-hand in its close formation, was massacred. The long, unwieldy spears became lethal impediments, tripping and tangling the Macedonian soldiers. The Roman legionary, moving freely with his short sword and shield, executed the trapped Macedonians with cold precision. King Philip V, witnessing the total collapse of his ancestral military pride, was forced to flee. Cynocephaly was more than a battle. It was the moment the Macedonian phalanx died. The tactical superiority of the Roman legion was proven, and the entire world realized that the Macedonian military dominance, which had begun with Philip II, was over. Rome's victory was absolute, but their political move afterward was a masterpiece of cunning. At the Isthmian Games in Corinth, the Roman proconsul, Titus Quinctius Flamininus, stood before a massive crowd and declared that, in the name of the Senate and people of Rome, all the Greek city-states were declared free and independent. The crowds erupted in hysterical joy, hailing Rome as the great liberator. In reality, this freedom was a carefully constructed diplomatic cage. By making the Greek cities independent, Rome shattered the Antagonids' ability to ever control the region again, effectively turning Greece into a network of indebted Roman client states. Philip V was forced to pay a massive indemnity, surrender his navy, and drastically reduce his army. The Antigonid dynasty was allowed to survive, but it was merely a weakened shadow, waiting for the final, inevitable strike. The lesson of Cynocephaly echoed across the entire Hellenistic world. The kings were powerful, but the Republic, with its endless manpower and adaptable military doctrine, was stronger still. The stage was now set for the final conflict, the Third Macedonian War, and the complete annihilation of the kingdom that had given birth to Alexander the Great. The Iron Heel and the end of the East. The defeat of Philip V at Cynocephaly was a temporary setback. The final death of the Antigonid dynasty was yet to come. It fell to Philip's son, Persis, the last king of Macedon, to make the final, doomed stand. Persis was a monarch who inherited his father's pride but none of his caution. He spent the years following the Second Macedonian War meticulously rebuilding the kingdom's financial reserves and army, driven by an ancestral fury to reclaim the honor lost to Rome. He knew the war was coming, and he prepared his country for a fight to the death. When the Third Macedonian War finally erupted in 171 BC, Persis's forces were formidable, better organized and better equipped than those fielded by Philip V. For 3 years, Persis fought the Romans to a stalemate, proving that the Macedonian phalanx, when properly deployed, was still a terrifying force. The Hellenistic world held its breath, hoping the king could somehow turn the tide, proving Alexander's bloodline was not yet exhausted. The climax arrived in 168 BC at the Battle of Pydna. The Macedonian army, numbering over 40,000 men, was placed under the command of a new Roman general, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a man of cold, methodical military genius. On the slopes near Pydna, the Macedonian phalanx deployed its final, magnificent array. As the two armies closed, The phalanx surged forward like a tidal wave of bronze and iron. The forest of 18-foot sarissas, bristling and impenetrable, tore through the Roman lines, forcing the legionaries backward. The sheer, kinetic force of the pike wall was overwhelming, proving, for one last hour, that the tactical genius of Philip II and Alexander was not forgotten. Victory seemed agonizingly close. But Paulus was patient and ruthless. He saw that the phalanx, in its irresistible advance, had crossed uneven, broken ground. The close, rigid formation began to stretch and crack. Small gaps, no wider than a man's shoulder, appeared between the tactical units. Paulus gave the fatal order: break the line. Instead of trying to meet the pikes head-on, the Roman legionaries abandoned their massive, continuous formation. They split into small, flexible detachments, using their heavy shields and short swords to plunge straight into those gaps. Inside the formation, the sarissas were useless. The Macedonians, unable to fight at close quarters, were defenseless. The battle dissolved into a frantic, internal massacre. The legionaries, fighting with a deadly, individualized ferocity, butchered the helpless Macedonians. It was not a defeat. It was an execution. 20,000 Macedonians died, cut down by the short sword that proved inherently superior to the long pike on broken ground. Persis fled, was quickly captured, and paraded in chains through the streets of Rome, a miserable testament to the end of the Antigonid line. Macedon was immediately and ruthlessly dissolved. The kingdom was split into 4 client republics, stripped of all its wealth, and permanently subjugated. The ancient line that had sired Alexander the Great and conquered the world was extinct. With Macedon neutralized, Rome turned its eyes to the colossal but staggering Seleucid Empire. This kingdom, though vast, was already internally rotting, weakened by constant wars with the Ptolemies and the relentless erosion of its eastern borders by the rising Parthian power. The Seleucids had one last burst of glory under Antiochus III the Great, a king who managed to briefly recapture lost territory and restore the empire's prestige. But Antiochus, too, made the fatal error of engaging Rome. In 190 BC, at the Battle of Magnesia, Antiochus III brought forth a massive Hellenistic army, complete with 54 war elephants and scythe chariots, the full tactical legacy of Alexander. Yet the outcome was even more lopsided than Pydna. The Roman allied forces, commanded by Scipio Asiaticus, brother of the famed Hannibal conqueror, utterly crushed the Seleucid forces. The sheer size and complexity of Antiochus's army proved a liability against the streamlined efficiency of the Romans. The consequences of this defeat were immediate and cataclysmic. By the Treaty of Apamea in 188 BC, Rome crippled the Seleucid Empire forever. Antiochus was forced to pay a colossal war indemnity in silver, surrender his entire navy, and withdraw all forces from Asia Minor, effectively ceding all territory west of the Taurus Mountains to Rome's allies. The vast Seleucid dream, the empire of 1,000 peoples, was suddenly reduced to a struggling kingdom in Syria and Mesopotamia, constantly vulnerable and perpetually bankrupt. The saga of Alexander's 3 great successor kingdoms was reduced to one final, isolated survivor: Ptolemaic Egypt. The golden, luxurious cage of Alexandria remained standing, but only because Rome permitted it. The ultimate symbol of this new world order came in 168 BC, the same year Macedon fell. The reigning Seleucid king, Antiochus IV, attempted to invade Egypt. As he marched on Alexandria, he was met by a lone Roman ambassador, Gaius Popilius Laenas. Popilius handed Antiochus a tablet containing the Senate's order: withdraw from Egypt immediately. When Antiochus, arrogant in his royal power, asked for time to consult his council, Popilius performed an unforgettable, devastating act. He bent down and drew a circle in the sand around the king with his walking stick. "Before you step out of the circle," Popilius stated, "give me a reply for the Roman Senate." The king of the Seleucid Empire, standing in a circle drawn in the dirt by a Roman citizen, hesitated. He looked at the circle, at the Roman's steely gaze, and realized the truth. His fate, and the fate of Alexander's entire Eastern Empire was now utterly dependent on the will of Rome. Humiliated and defeated, Antiochus agreed to withdraw. The circle in the sand marked the moment the Hellenistic age died. Only one kingdom remained, fragile and alone, waiting for its queen to make the final, dramatic defiance.